We're at the conclusion of the Energy Psychology Conference, and I have the pleasure of talking to
Dr. David Gruder.
And Doctor, you're a specialist in what area?
I'm a clinical and organizational development psychologist who specializes in integrity throughout all different levels of society, from individuals to businesses to governance.
Now, we like to talk about health and wellness, and to better understand it, I feel we need to understand the integrity around it. And apparently you're called America's integrity expert. Why is that?
Well, it's really because I have a 6 award-winning book on integrity development called The New IQ, How Integrity Intelligence Serves You, Your Relationships, and Our World. And having done hundreds of media interviews related to that topic, the American media just kind of latched on to that moniker. I didn't create it, the media created it for me.
Now, you really, in your presentation here at the Energy Psychology Conference, you really actually started your talk, your foundation actually started dealing with, I'd like to use the word media, but you actually went into public relations. Is that correct? And you mentioned and you expounded on the American dream. Let's talk about that, because I think that relates to the integrity, the foundation of the integrity of wellness and other things in general.
Well, absolutely. You know, the 1950s version of the American dream, which is actually an American nightmare, is in complete contradiction to the foundation of the experiment that free societies are engaged in, which is creating a society that lives at the intersection of preserving individual freedom and promoting the common good. And all in the service of the pursuit of happiness. And in the 1950s, the pursuit of happiness got redefined, and it got redefined because at the end of World War II, there was real fear that what happened in Nazi Germany could happen anywhere, and that the economic recovery that occurred as a result of World War II, because of the war, they wanted the economic recovery to not backslide. They wanted the economy to continue to expand in peacetime. And so the combination of those two concerns led to the creation of this thing that was called the American Dream. And the American Dream's foundational principles, let's call it, were that the pursuit of happiness was replaced with the pursuit of excessive consumerism. So happiness got redefined as excessive consumerism, and in support of excessive consumerism, there was conformity and overwork that were going to make the excessive consumerism feasible, supposedly, except that it didn't really work so well, which meant that people who bought into that new version of the American dream needed to start engaging in more and more debt accumulation in order to have the latest consumer goods and thereby make their family happy, as was told to them with this new American dream.
Now, in your presentation, you were talking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and you were involved during that era at Woodstock, I think. How does that tie into the American dream and the false perception of that?
Sure. Well, what the 1960s really were about, from my perspective as a member of the baby boomer generation that grew up then, is that they were an attempt to rebel against the American dream, the American nightmare that was installed in the 1950s, except that there wasn't enough clarity at that time about what was being rebelled against to do that rebellion in an effective way. And on top of that, the intuitive attempt at rebellion led to a cliche called sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
That's where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And what's underneath the cliche of sex, drugs, and rock and roll is that the sex part was actually about an attempt to discover a more whole and complete version of love than the conforming obligation-based forms of love that had existed up until then, and especially got magnified in the 1950s. The drugs part of sex, drugs, and rock and roll underneath the cliche was actually an attempt to reclaim authenticity and discover who we really were and expand our consciousness, in contrast to the conformity rules of the 1950s. And the rock and roll part of Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, underneath that part of the cliche, music did something new in the 1960s that had never really occurred before in our history, as far as we know of the history of humanity, which was that there were lyrics appearing in songs that dared to inform us and inspire us about the fact that we could make positive social change, that we could actually have positive impact on improving society.
Okay, you talked about manufactured consent in relation to the American dream and how we're being manipulated in all areas of life, which creates a huge stress on the individual, individually and collectively. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Well, the way that the 1950s American nightmare was installed was through a set of strategies that were called manufactured consent strategies by the originator of those strategies, whose name was Edward Bernays. And what manufactured consent is manipulating through the use of propaganda the support of products, services, causes, or candidates in the minds of the consumers in such a way that the consumer or the voter thinks that what they're supporting comes from their own free will, when in fact it doesn't.
So how does all this, actually I'd like to go back, you were talking about the individual, the group, and then giving back as a society. You had three specific things there. I need you to talk about those three specific things as part of your model.
Absolutely.
To understand this overall integrity issue.
Well, this goes back to Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, because the sex part was relationships, the drugs part was individual authenticity, and the rock and roll part was social change. And we all have, as far as I can tell as a psychologist, three core drives that we come into life with. They're born into our wiring. And those drives are for authenticity, which is the drive to be who we truly are, connection, which is our drive to bond with others, and impact, which is our drive to positively influence the world around us. Well, authenticity translates into self-integrity, connection translates into relationship integrity, and impact translates into collective or societal integrity. So integrity is really a three-dimensional thing, and what's very interesting to me as a psychologist is that sustainably happy people report that they feel like they are who they truly are. They're being who they truly are. They're authentic. They enjoy the bonds that they have with others, connection, core drive, which is relationship integrity, and they have positive impact. They feel like they have positive impact in whatever spheres of influence they're choosing to have positive impact. So those three core drives are not only our recipe for sustainable happiness, they're also our recipe for sustainable integrity.
Well, how does this integrity integrate into our integrative models of wellness, especially that we're talking about here at the Energy Psychology Conference? We're trying to look at different models that we can integrate into our models of wellness.
Well, the dictionary defines integrity as a state of being whole and complete in reference to or using as a touchstone some ethical or moral code. Well, the ethical or moral code is in our wiring: authenticity, connection, and impact. And the state of being whole and complete is exactly that. It is 1/3 me, which is authenticity, 1/3 we, which is connection, and 1/3 us all, which is impact. And that is the new integrative model for healing.
And when you're out of balance, that 1/3 could be 1/16 or 1/4 or 99%.
Exactly. And so the important innovation in healthcare in the latter part of the 20th century, which was called integrative wellness or holistic health, that was mind-body-spirit reintegration. But that's just me, and me. Now the next step is to go from just being me-centered to being balanced and integrated among me, we, and us all.
There's the enlightenment there.
Yes.
And that's in your book?
Yes, it is. It's in the new IQ. Yes.
Okay.
The new IQ, that IQ is integrity quotient.
Interesting. Yeah. How would you summarize all that wisdom in relation to, a therapist embracing this new information that you have, this new IQ?
Well, There really are, because of the American nightmare that wasn't confined to the United States, but spread around the world. There were 5 really key areas in which our lives and our well-being and our societies have been hijacked. And those lies have to do with the hijacking of happiness, health, prosperity, social responsibility, and problem solving.
Well, to know more about this, we're going to have to read your book and to delve into more deeply. Your website would be?
My website is drgruder.com. That's drgruder.com. But also go to hijackingofhappiness.com to read more about this last part of what we were just talking about.
I think that title summarizes the whole thing, and that will help us get then back to integrity. Thank you so much.
Thank you.